So then, in the last discussion, we were exploring the line, the fourfold practice is the best of methods. And in this, we were able to cover the first three of these fourfold practice. And now we arrive at the fourth of these fourfold practice, which is the practice of offering, the practice of making offering to what we call the Dharma protectors. So similar to the practice of offering, making offering to the harmful influences, spirits and such. So herein, you make the same kind of offering to what we call the Dharma protectors. Geshe den Thekchok. So now we move on to the next line of instruction, which reads, whatever you encounter, apply the practice. So herein, when we say, when the instruction says, whatever you encounter, apply the practice herein refers to the practice that helps us to overcome our self-cherishing attitude, the practice that helps us to overcome that innate grasping at the self. So whatever kind of experiences you might have in moments of joy, in moments of suffering, it is important to remember this practice to be able to make the aspiration to offer your happiness and virtue to others, to take upon the suffering and negative karma of others upon oneself, to overcome that grasping at the self. Bless. So in a nutshell, what this instruction is advising us to do is not to have an intense reaction to either experiences of suffering or to either experiences of joy. So when you find yourself in moments of joy, do not get carried away. And when you find yourself in moments of pain and suffering, do not become easily discouraged, but to always remember the practice of offering your joy, your virtue to others, taking upon the suffering of others, in an effort to overcome that grasping at the self. So now, after this, we arrived at the fourth set of instruction, which relates to applying the practice throughout the whole of life. So, building a sacred commitment to your spiritual practice for a lifetime. So the essence of the instruction, briefly stated, is to apply yourself to the 5 strengths. The Mahayana advice for transference involves the same 5 strengths. Conduct is important. So, as we already said, at this point, through training in the first through training in the first 3 sets of instructions, at this point we are building a sacred commitment to our spiritual practice for a lifetime. So herein, when we say that at this point we are looking to develop a sacred commitment to our spiritual practice for our life in this lifetime, there are 2 points, 2 points, 2 points that we need to understand. One instruction refers to how to cultivate genuine spiritual practice over the course of our life. The other instruction refers to how to cultivate spiritual practice at the moment of death. So when we look at the first line of this instructions, the essence of the instruction, briefly stated, is to apply yourself to the 5 strengths. So the essence of the instruction that is being referred to here, when we look at the Buddha's teachings, then the teachings are indeed very vast and extensive, profound in their nature. So even when we look at the 2 sets of teachings in the sutras, the collection of the actual collection of his words, as well as the tantric teachings, the esoteric teachings, and even when we look at the 3 wheels of dharma that the Buddha turned, the 3 sets of teachings that he gave over his lifetime. The first turning of wheel of the dharma, the second turning wheel of the dharma, the third turning wheel of the dharma, as well as what we call the 3 scriptural baskets of his teachings. All of these vast and extensive collection of teachings, the Buddha gave this teaching in essence to help us to overcome that self-cherishing attitude we have. And not only the Buddha's own teachings, when we look at the subsequent classical Indian masters' commentaries and the treatises that they compose, then the hard advice of all of these teachings is to help us to overcome that innate conception of the self, that self-cherishing attitude. And when we look at Master Shantideva's advice, then he also makes the same point, that all the branches of teachings that the Buddha has offered us ultimately is to help us to realize the wisdom of emptiness. So now, if one is to develop that sacred commitment to spiritual practice by understanding the essence of the teachings, then, as the instruction states, the essence of the instruction, briefly stated, is to apply yourself to the 5 strengths. So your spiritual practice must be sustained by applying these 5 strengths. Now, to enumerate what are these 5 strengths, the first of these 5 strengths is the strength of impetus. So now, the first of these strength, the strength of impetus, refers to impelling our own minds to engage in spiritual practice, motivating ourselves. Now, from now on, I will engage in spiritual practice. I will engage in virtuous activities. So, more particularly in line with this 7 points of instruction, it relates to developing the motivation to train in both relative and ultimate bodhicitta. But generally, with regards to our spiritual practice, we can understand the first strength as shaping our motivation to effectively engage in spiritual practice, to effectively engage in virtuous activities. Now, the second of these strengths is the strength of familiarization. So, on the basis of having first shaped our motivation in a way that we are impelled to train in both ultimate and relative bodhicitta, then on the basis of that, one constantly apply oneself to train again and again in developing developing these 2 types of bodhicitta. So that is the strength of familiarization. So similarly, in this context, we look at the strength of familiarization as being repeatedly training in the 2 types of bodhicitta, but more generally with regards to our spiritual practice, when we talk about the importance of qualities of the mind such as love, compassion, and so forth, then the strength of familiarization herein refers to cultivating and developing and cultivating love, compassion, and so forth on the basis of contemplating on these again and again and again. Now, so on the basis of shaping our motivation to make ourselves impelled to engage in spiritual practice, we begin to familiarize ourselves constantly with the training in both relative and ultimate bodhicitta. And then on the basis of that, we arrive at the third strength, which is the strength of wholesome deeds. Now, literally, it says the strength of white seeds. So, white in this context refers to wholesome deed. Wholesome. So the strength of wholesome seeds or wholesome deeds refers to accumulating merit, accumulating virtue as much as possible, so that the bodhicitta that we want to generate within ourselves arises and increases. So on the basis of the strength of impetus, we become impelled to engage in spiritual activities, and then we train ourselves in these again and again. And as a result of that, we are able to accumulate as much merit as possible, by engaging in virtuous actions of the body, virtuous action of the speech, virtuous action of the mind. So the manner in which we can cultivate virtuous actions of the body, we can begin to make prostrations, circumambulations, making offerings. Then virtuous actions of speech, we can begin to recite mantras, the name mantra of the Buddha. Then we can also begin to recite and study the teachings of the Buddha. And then similarly, with regards to the virtuous actions of the mind, we can begin to develop, as we already discussed before, pure aspiration, pure motivation, and then to apply this and to mentally express this in our meditation to gain conviction in our practices and the teachings. Now the fourth of these strength is the strength of revulsion, or the strength of the antidote themselves. So when we say that the fourth strength is the strength of revulsion or remedy, though this is how it is translated in English, in the original Tibetan, it refers to cleaning away the slate in a sense. Cleaning away the slate in a sense that whenever this kind of self-cherishing attitude arises in us, whenever our actions become informed by this self-cherishing attitude, as we already discussed in the purification process, we should be able to immediately confront it, immediately able to address it, and as such apply the antidote of overcoming such self-cherishing attitude. Now the fifth of these strength is the strength of aspiration. So the strength of aspiration is important because as we now already discussed, on the basis of applying these strengths, one begins to accumulate merit by engaging in virtuous activities. So it is important at the end of any kind of virtuous activity to make that aspiration that through the virtue or through the merit that I gain from this virtuous activity, may all sentient beings achieve happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering, and may I be able to. It is important to dedicate your root virtue to achieving enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings. So this is the manner in which we develop a sacred commitment to our spiritual practice by applying these 5 strengths. So with any kind of virtuous activity, spiritual practice that we undertake, if we apply these 5 strengths effectively, then the root virtue, the merit that we gain from these practices become profound, become very pure. So it is crucially important to understand these 5 strengths if we are to effectively cultivate a meaningful spiritual practice. So to sum up our discussion again, so first one needs to develop the strength of impetus, wherein we begin to shape our motivation, which can help us to effectively engage in our spiritual practice. Then on the basis of that motivation, then we constantly dedicate ourselves to train in these again and again. And on the basis of that, we actually begin to accumulate merit by actually engaging in virtuous activities of the body, speech, and mind. And then, in the moments when we begin to notice that our actions, our practice become influenced by selfish concerns, self-cherishing attitude, that at that moment it is important to apply the remedy immediately. And then at the end of any virtuous activity, it is important to make the aspiration that this root virtue that you have accumulated is not only for yourself, but you are dedicating this root virtue, this merit that you have accumulated by engaging in virtuous activities in spiritual practices for the sake of all sentient beings. Now, if we are able to approach our spiritual practice, any kind of virtuous activity that we undertake in this manner by applying the 5 strengths, then the root virtue that we accumulate, the merit that we accumulate becomes profound, becomes meaningful, becomes very powerful. So it is important to approach any kind of action that we undertake to help others, that it must be embraced by the application of the 5 strengths. And this is exactly the reason in Buddhism we say that at the end and at the start of any activity, at the end and at the start of anything, there are 2 activities. So the first activity is motivation, developing a pure motivation. At the end of anything, to always make that aspiration, to make that dedication, to dedicate your merits for the sake of all sentient beings. So now, as we already discussed before, that when we are talking about these fourth set of instructions, it is related to developing a sacred commitment to our spiritual practice throughout our lives. So the discussion on the 5 strengths that we just had relates to cultivating a spiritual practice over the course of our life. Now, the next set of instructions refers to spiritual practice for the moment of death. Now, we apply the same 5 strengths as 5 strengths even at the moment of death. So, at the moment when you begin to realize that death is imminent, that death is imminent, then it is important to remember the strength of wholesome deeds first. So even at the moment of death, when we begin to realize that death is imminent, it is important to remember to engage in a virtuous activity. That is the strength of the wholesome seeds or wholesome deeds. So if you can, at the moment of death, it is important that if you can physically move about a bit, it is important at that moment to make an offering to the 3 jewels. And if you cannot do it physically, then mentally, within your own mind, begin to visualize that you are making an offering of all your virtues and of all your merits to the 3 jewels at that moment. So it is important to remember this kind of instructions, that when death seems imminent, if you realize that you can move about, that you are still physically able to move about, it is important to engage in a virtuous activity by making offerings, by practicing generosity and so forth. But if you cannot move about and physically you cannot move about, then it is important to remember that you can also begin to make an offering through visualization, making an offering of all your virtues and all your merits to the 3 jewels. Now, for the moment of death, the second strength that needs to be applied is the strength of aspiration. Now, for the moment of death, then the second strength is the strength of aspiration. Now, on the basis of having at the moment of death, either having made an offering mentally or having engaged in a virtuous activity at the moment of death, it is important to dedicate that root virtue, to dedicate that merit for your future life, making an aspiration in this manner. May I never come under the influence of self-cherishing attitude in my future lives. May I never be parted from the trainings of relative and ultimate bodhicitta. May I continue to cultivate my spiritual practice in my future lives. Now the third strength for the moment of death we need to apply is the strength of remedy. Now, as we already discussed extensively before, herein remedy refers to the antidote or cultivating the antidote for self-cherishing attitude. So even at the moment of death, it is important to remember this, that if you still are clinging on to a sense of self and still have thoughts of self-cherishing, then it is important to reflect in this manner that all my suffering, all the harm that I experience does indeed originate from this self-cherishing attitude, does indeed originate from this grasping at the self. So as such, even at that point, it is important, if you can, to effectively try to overcome that grasping of the self or that self-cherishing attitude. If not, to make the aspiration that may I be able to overcome this self-cherishing attitude. Now, the fourth strength applied for the moment of death is the strength of impetus. So herein, we are trying to cultivate a strong intention, that one would continue to train, and one would never be apart from the training of ultimate and relative bodhicitta, not just in their next lifetimes, but even in the intermediate state between this life and the next life. Now, the last of the five strengths applied for the moment of death is the strength of familiarization. So at this point, you are recollecting or remembering the ways in which you have trained in ultimate and relative bodhicitta over the course of your life. And it is said that it is particularly important to remember a virtuous activity or a root virtue that we have accumulated at the moment of death. Rather than facing death with fear, anxiety, it is important to remember a good thing, a virtuous activity that you have engaged in, and to remember that root virtue or root merit that you have accumulated. And even when we look at the instructions in tantric practice, and the manner in which the yogis train and practice themselves. This is effectively what they do. They train themselves to become familiar with the mind when it is faced with death, and to be able to face death without fear, to be able to remember these instructions at the moment of death clearly. Now, okay, I forgot to translate one last bit. At the moment of death, the purpose of remembering a root virtue, or the purpose of remembering a root virtue or a virtuous activity that you have engaged in, is that at the moment of death, if your mind abides in the thought of such a root virtue, or in the thought of such a virtuous activity, it is said that this has a huge influence in the next birth that you will take. It effectively decides the impelling karma that dictates your next birth. And now moving on with the text, we arrive at the fifth set of instruction. So the instruction reads, all teachings share a single purpose. Of the two witnesses, rely upon the principal one. Always maintain only a joyful attitude. If this can be done even when distracted, you are proficient. Now, this instruction refers to the measure of having effectively trained in the mind training instructions. So the first line, all teachings share a single purpose, is the same instruction in the fourth set of instructions when you say the essence of the instruction. So as we already discussed, all of the Buddha's teachings point towards the wisdom of emptiness, which is in effect a means to overcome our afflictions, and more particularly the source of our afflictions, which is that innate grasping at the self. So even when we do realize that all of the teachings that the Buddha has given us effectively is means to overcome or tame this self-grasping. Now, if we are to gauge, if we are to estimate whether we have now effectively trained in these teachings, if we have effectively practiced these teachings, then the next line specifies, of the two witnesses, rely upon the principal one. So herein, when it says of the two witnesses, rely upon the principal one, the two witnesses refers to yourself as a witness and others as a witness. So there could be, in this manner, there could be two witnesses to our spiritual development. One, people can begin to appreciate that this person has really changed now. This person is less arrogant. This person is now living very ethically and so forth. Now the other witness is ourselves. Only we can effectively be judges of our own attitudes, of our own practice. So we need to look closely at whether our sense of self has become diminished, or whether the afflictions that used to dominate us, dominate our attitude and behaviors, have somewhat become pacified as a measure of having trained effectively. So if we are to measure our progress, spiritual progress, then it is important that we rely on ourselves as honest witness to our own spiritual progress. So we have to be honestly, we have to be effectively able to look at our own mind and begin to honestly see if our grasping at the self has become weaker, if the afflictions have become weaker within our mind stream. So if we are effectively looking for signs that we have now trained properly, that we have trained the mind effectively, then we shouldn't really depend upon other people's estimation of our mental states, because this is impossible. Other people cannot effectively gauge and estimate your improvement and your training and your progress. So as such, it is important that we take an unembarrassed look at our own mental states and look at how strong is the grasping at the self, and how powerful are still the afflictions such as attachment and aversion within our mind stream. So if we come to realize that our grasping at the self has become weaker, and if we come to realize that attachment and aversion and these afflictions do not dominate and consume our mental states so much, then it is a sign. You can take that as an effective sign that now you have achieved some result in the mind training. Now, it is important that when we say that we are people who strive for spiritual practice, or when we call ourselves spiritual practitioners, it is important to remember the purpose of spirituality. That if through our own spiritual practice, if it is the case that rather than overcoming these afflictions, rather than our grasping at the self becoming weaker, if we become all the more attached, all the more angry, and we grasp all the more strongly at this sense of self, then you have defeated the whole purpose of spirituality. At that point, the medicine itself has turned into poison. So it is important to take an honest look at the manner in which we approach our spiritual practice.
총원이 체제 제시하되 알레 총원 마변하지 맞아 칠pen 소화에나 미 도도 지와도지 차로 그래서
So this is very, very important to remember that the whole purpose of spiritual practice, the whole purpose of mind training is to help us to overcome that grasping at the self, to overcome the afflictions that arise as a result of this grasping at the self. Now, if we begin to develop a sense of arrogance, a sense of attachment, a sense of aversion due to our own spiritual practice, then at that point, as I stated before, the medicine itself has now turned into poison. So this is exactly the reason in Tibetan Buddhism we have expressions such as now the deities have turned into demons. So deities and gods, we look for protection, we look for protection. But if the very thing that we look for protection begins to harm us, then they are deities or gods no more. They have turned into demons. So similarly, with regards to our spiritual practice is a process of transformation, transforming the negative qualities of the mind through training into positive qualities of the mind. Now, if our spiritual training does not help us in this process, in this manner, then our spiritual practice, which is a form of antidote or a medicine, has now turned into poison. So if you are able to achieve this kind of measure of mind training, if you are able to overcome that grasping at the self, if you are able to overcome your afflictions and the manner in which it consumes and influences your actions, then you can begin to experience a true sense of joy, a true sense of happiness, a true sense of fulfillment. And so as the root text goes on to say, always maintain a joyful attitude. This is what it is referring to. Now, the root text further goes on to say, if this can be done even when distracted, you are proficient now. Now, this is the actual measure of having trained effectively. So, when we look at this instruction, if this can be done even when distracted, you are proficient, then the analogy that is used to explain this is, now a skilled rider, a skilled horse rider becomes skilled only on the basis of training. He was at one point unskilled, but through training, he comes to a point wherein even when he's distracted, even if the horse moves about a bit, a skilled rider does not fall from the horse. So similarly, with our own trainings, even though we might be beginners at first in mind training, we should be able to, even when we are distracted, not to lose that kind of motivation and that kind of aspiration.
제시가 많이 봐. 생인비 니까 되게 ging 바체라고 지 중앙하고 있나요? 되게 소소가 생인데 제 바체 공원도 못 봐지니 제 바체 대용 가르서는 란드 치토바지. 생인비 니까 제 바체도 중앙 있나요? 되게 제 바체데 소소기 남양이 근데 로한 체 되게 지 중앙이나 당연히 그 가르서는 로좀 또 야고지 중이 아니 다르고 그래서 모두 지리샤고 그래서
Now, this instruction, if this can be even done when distracted, you are proficient, is the actual measure of having trained effectively. Now, as we discussed extensively before, if we are to cultivate these mind training instructions effectively, we have to apply the 5 strengths. Not only that, through the application of the 5 strengths, we can and we must be able to transform any kind of challenges, any kind of setbacks, adversities that we face onto the path of our spiritual practice. So, if it is the case that sometimes when you become distracted, when you are not focused, if challenges present themselves, then the measure of having trained effectively in mind training instructions is to be able to turn that moment of distraction when it passes into a course for the awakening mind, into a course to be able to turn this kind of adversity and challenges into the path of enlightenment. Chidun.
주든 살아 따들라 누가 주는 롱소샤 아니 가래래 얘나 냐바 주면자 이진주 공연 무상모 이모 공치 공연은 좀 리버리와 단지 공스 도진지 세본 jonsomo 마데 샹예 마고 총마고 내나나베 조카로는 뭐죠 주기 찌르데 아니 가래
Dolomicha.
돌로면자 나 딘드르바 아니 지지 얘나 도 마소스야데 가르치 그래서나 딱 아주 좁아 아니 로주기 단시 때 마스야 돼 어떻게 자기 해서 되지죠.
Now, moving along with the root text itself, the 6th set of instructions read, train constantly in the 3 basic principles, change your attitude but remain natural, don't speak of injured limbs, don't ponder others' flaws, train first with the strongest destructive emotions, abandon any expectations of results, give up poisonous food, don't be so loyal to the cause, don't lash out in retaliation, don't lie in ambush, don't strike a vulnerable point, don't transfer the ox's burden to the cow, don't be competitive, don't misperform the rites, don't reduce gods to demons, don't seek others' misery as crutches of your own happiness. So this set of instructions refer to the commitments of mind training. So, as the title itself suggests, in this set of instructions, these are commitments. So we know what commitments are. Commitments are things that you are willing to take upon yourself. Thus. Now, when it says train constantly in the 3 basic principles, now we need to be heedful of these 3 basic principles in all aspects of our spiritual practice. And the first 3 of these basic principles is not to transgress the mind training commitments. So when it says that when it says that train constantly in the three basic principles, the first of these three basic principles is not to transgress the commitments of mind training. So we know now, by now, that the commitment of mind training instructions is to overcome that grasping at the self, that self-cherishing attitude, and in its place to be able to cultivate love, care, compassion for others. So the first commitment is to not transgress that commitment.
제도 딱 말로 좀 며칠 논의 주디디 가르레스나 이제나 내가 지와지와데 가르레스나 공태다 공연하고 제도 안에 지가르스 이제는 로바지와도 패상지야라고 돼 공태다 그 소득이 빼터야 어떻게 지야지 차리기리에서.
So in short, what this means is you now commit yourself to help and benefit others as much as you can, and to avoid and refrain hurting or inflicting harm upon others as much as you can.
저도 다 노도도 가는 장면에서 가는 뒤뒤뒤 소속의 쩌는 이날에 상반하고 이날에 뒤뒤는 제바도 시식이 바이오지 이제는 상반에 봐도 뒤뒤는 어들이 제고 말이 세야도 이제는 패상 있는 가리 있는 뒤뒤 펜투도 제고 그래 이제는 내봐도 세바 제지고 말이 세야돼 뒤시 주디 때니 소속의 카운터들이 이제는 피비 상반으로 버지야 되지 카운터들이 내봐도 아니 그 채워줘야 돼 카운터다 공부해야 돼 또 지금 자되게 그래서
So, if in our spiritual practice, in our daily lives, it is important that we constantly become heedful of our attitudes and behaviors at all times. Now, if we are to become heedful, conscious of our attitudes and behavior at all times, it is important to cultivate mindfulness and vigilance to ensure that our attitudes does not transgress the commitments of mind training, that our behaviors does not contradict or does not transgress the mind training commitments. So as such, through mindfulness and vigilance, we remain heedful, not to engage in harmful activities, but to try to dedicate our effort and time as much as we can to help others, to benefit others. Now, the second of these three principles is to not to be reckless. So, the second of these three basic principles is not to be reckless. Now, not to be reckless herein refers to if you begin to develop an air of superiority about yourself and make a show of having received the instructions on mind training, or having trained in the mind training instructions, and begin to publicly make a show of it, begin to publicly develop an air of superiority, saying that now I am superior to others because I have trained in these instructions, because I have received these instructions, then that transgresses the mind training commitments. Now, the third of these three basic principles is not to fall into partiality. So herein, when it says not to fall into partiality, it refers to our own spiritual practice. When it says not to fall into partiality is the third basic principle. The manner, if you approach your spiritual practice in this manner, that your spiritual practice is self-serving in its nature. Only when you are feeling well, only when you are happy, if you only want to practice, then that's not the underlying principle of mind training instructions. And if you find yourself sick, if you find yourself disturbed, then you do not want to practice this at all. That's self-serving, and that's very partial. So as such, it is important to cultivate these practices universally, regularly. So shall we stop here for the moment? Okay, we break for tea and gather again in half an hour.